That's wrong. I'm like, okay, it's here. There's a couple things that could be helpful to you guys now.
Yeah.
Listings. I've seen like this.
Right. Yeah,
That's that's nice to know.
it's getting more relevant.
Yes, it is. Then $2.
It's good at you getting.
Yeah, we love selling.
Yeah.
See, I was everything. It does, I mean, it just looks so much more professional.
Right, of course. Right,
Yeah,
of
the way I see that.
course. Yeah, everything's on these things.
Yeah, I was looking and I just. But it didn't turn out.
Good, how are you? Good, be sure and grab some documents back here.
I printed
Got yours?
it, forgot.
Get yours.
Oh, I'm here for, as the sponsor.
Oh, tell me who you are.
I'm Brian with Snap House.
Well, how's Snap House going?
It's going good. We just launched earlier this year. So we're just
Good.
trying to get out to all the brokers.
Well, thank you for being here.
Of course. Appreciate you leading the class, Bob.
I am the instructor
Nice to meet you.
today. Position knows I sometimes have panels and co-instructors, but
Right.
today it's just me.
Nice.
Potatoes. With the contract.
We have a lot of things that have been happening that we need to talk about. A lot of things. More than we have time to talk. Oh, how you been doing, ma'am?
Market, but
It is a crazy market.
that's.
You know, we say that a lot, but it really is. I don't,
Managed in 6 weeks, you know?
daily it changes. I mean, it's one of those things that I can't imagine a buyer seller trying to work their way through this without a good agent. Because it's just, I mean,
It's just,
I've been a broker for 55 years. I've never seen this.
and it's also, you know, area location related, Dallas versus Plano versus Frisco, there's.
We've got some agents doing stuff in Fort Worth. Different work.
I haven't been there, but yeah,
Hey,
yes, so it's very different in Dallas.
yep.
Versus.
And depending on where you are in Dallas, like if you're in uptown, that's a whole different situation. But if you're in the Carroll Farmers Branch area,
I know where I live in here.
you're in Preston Hollow and
Yeah,
just off of that. It's one of those things and I'm on one of the Trek committees where we talked about, like, we're the ones that sent the recommendation to Trek on geographic competency. It's one of the things that Trek requires. Our problem is, one, it's too vague a term. I don't know what it means. Does it mean that somebody who's an agent in Plano has to be good about Frisco and Salina and Allen and McKinney? Move a little bit further up, maybe Sherman Denison or maybe Blue Ridge. You know, how far does that expand and what does it include? It's a real tricky little concept,
yes.
but it's one of the things that Trek holds us to. How we doing, ma'am?
How are you?
I'm okay. Tell me your name.
I know.
Huh?
I figured it was time for me to show up.
Well, it was.
And we both Philadelphia.
Well, she's now for all kind. Once she was on a great vacation. I understand the Colorado trip was great.
What?
Y'all did good. Okay, but Sean Barber, okay. You've done something to your hair.
Yes.
See, it's incredibly impressive.
It
that I noticed that
Did
because
you notice?
one of the challenges around my house is unless I hear rumors that my wife's about to go get her hair done, I don't know. I
That
can't
sounds like
tell.
my husband.
Hello, Mike.
Hey, everybody.
How are you, sir?
Hi, Mike.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Hey. How are
It's
you?
you.
Yeah, it's me.
Yay. Yeah, so good to see you.
You too.
She was in the neighborhood, don't you?
Yes, I eat at Taverna Rosa and I'm very full. Brian, that's it?
Sorry, sir.
Yeah, bring it up for everybody.
Hey, it's out in my car. That's over.
Well, we always give the realtors a little time to show up
Right, right.
because the realtor's job is to be late for everything.
Oh.
If you do a funeral, how it is, so.
Listing appointment.
Well, that's true. It's a good point. Yeah.
Hey, how are you? I hear you were my husband's weekend. Oh my gosh, I was. He was so helpful.
I'm so glad.
Oh my gosh.
What are we talking about?
So Paul let me shadow his open house.
Oh, good.
Oh my gosh, I couldn't believe it. I was like, I never thought of that. That's brilliant. Oh,
Yeah, he's all
That's
those years
great.
in sales and was
Sorry,
just-
how you doing?
I will, sir, yourself.
Good. Thanks for being here. In case we get to
Thanks
a
for having me.
very interesting financing question, we'll know to ask you.
Please do.
Work through that. So Jeff is our in-house person with Benchmark. That you probably haven't met. Probably don't.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
Hi, man, Justin. That's you.
Okay. So, I don't know if it's out or,
Do what?
did y'all cater food for this?
He's bringing something. He brought some.
Right.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
he'll come up and he'll speak to us and then have the whatever. You make sure you get paperwork if you didn't download it back there in the back. Family quiz and everything else.
Quiz?
There is a quiz.
I thought that was the next.
I sent it to you yesterday.
Hey, Paul. Hi, Paul.
I did see that.
But you have plenty of opportunities to review it.
Yep.
Take it and look at it.
And Paul was on his way and got a flat tire.
There's a lot of that going around.
Yeah.
My daughter had one and then somebody else I know.
Everybody.
Yeah, he screw it in the tire, right, Polly?
that's what I had to screw.
Yep. Right dead in the middle.
My daughter had run into a thing and popped the tire, just ran into something, so. Woman driver, you know what I'm saying.
Oh. Bob.
And my wife continues to always remind me, I have never had an accident and you have. She's right, she's never had one. She's never even got a speeding ticket.
Mr. Jesse, I see you wanting to talk. Do not speak if you want to live past today. Polly.
Where's Larry? Because you need to monitor his quota of
I
questions.
didn't watch it.
It's your day?
It's not my.
Not your day. Oh, okay. Okay,
Be here.
yeah. I tell you what, it was amazing. That investor deal he did, Patricia's listing, well, there he is, so stop talking about it, because you know how he is. He gets a big head, he thinks it's easy
Totally.
to talk about him all the time. But for him to step up and in a short period of time, get that stuff done was amazing. Now, it may have been, if you're gonna be in a backup,
We're gonna be back.
yeah,
Somebody else is overpaying.
yeah. Well, and once they get into the deal and realize what they've done, they may walk away. And you will be in a perfect position, so, to work out. Everybody has their paperwork, you've got the quiz. I'll give you a couple minutes to peruse it. And, now right back and then we'll go through it, because these are all things that we've dealt with some of them fairly recently. The challenges, situations that we have. They keep creating challenges, gotta work through them, but this, doing it in this way lets us have a lot of good discussions and conversations about it. Everybody look at number one and not only see the answer, what's the concept behind it? And then before we officially get started, let our structure person come back and talk to us. But I want to, not leave it. I want a couple other people want to. Please come on up to the front, sir. Awesome. Introduce yourself and
Thank you.
tell us about all the great photographs you guys take.
Well, I'll go ahead and pass out my flyer real quick.
Good idea.
I'm Brian with Snap House.
Thank you.
It's I already got you one. It's a real estate photography firm, full service that we recently launched in the Metroplex earlier this year. And so we do everything. It's not just pictures anymore. We do cinematic video, we do 3D tours, we do 2D floor plans, you know.
Okay, so what's a 2D floor plan?
So a 2D floor plan is just like the dimensions of the house, the layout.
Okay,
Right,
okay.
it looks like a construction drawing.
Like a plan.
Like a planning, and
Okay.
it's derived from the captures we take with the Matterport camera, if you're familiar with this.
No.
So it's like the Matterport camera is how you do the.
See, he doesn't understand my limitations regarding technology, which includes what he's talking about, but it sounds good.
Right.
Oh, it's good.
So yeah, the Matterport camera is obviously what you do the 3D tour with, and we get the 2D schematic from that. Beyond that, we do, you know, virtual staging, drone photography, drone video. We actually do renderings too for construction, unbuilt homes. We work with a lot of home builders on that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of different products we have to offer. We also have an app, so you can book it kind of like Uber Eats, and you can watch the photographer, you know, on their way to the listing, and it's all streamlined. So you don't really have to like play phone tag with like a, you know, one-off photographer anymore. And we can assign a specific photographer to you because we know that a lot of other, you know, firms, there's inconsistency and a realtor might like a specific photographer that they've gotten, you know, accustomed to their work. And we have a 24-hour turnaround too, because we've got a team of editors working overnight. So, you know, it's really kind of a streamlined process where we've got it all back to you within 24 hours. And if you'll look, I included a recent, the QR code. I would encourage you guys to look at that. It's a shot that we were proud of that we took, I think maybe about 2 weeks ago. I just figured I'd include a relevant one where we did the drone videos, all of the cinematic videos and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So if you guys just really had any questions.
How do you access the property?
So it depends on the relationship with the realtor. So First time, well, obviously, we're bonded and insured and all that good stuff. So the first time, typically the realtor will meet us there, but once they feel comfortable with us, they'll typically just leave a lockbox code, and so they don't have to waste their time. So it really just depends. We can do either. If the realtor prefers to be present.
Okay, so everybody needs to listen up on this, including you, Brian. We won't share lockbox codes.
Right, yeah, so if that's not a policy that you guys were doing,
It's
well,
not.
we're completely fine to do.
Our agent will need to meet you or have some of his staff or men meet you.
Right, so yeah,
Or work something out with a listing agent.
right, we're set up to do both.
Perfect.
Yep.
Okay, good. Everybody good with that?
Yes, yep.
Yeah, and we're completely MLS compliant too, so we do like branded websites too, and we have like some branded video options, social media teasers, but all of our core work will send you guys an MLS compliant, the format so that it doesn't, get thrown off any of the systems.
May I have one of those?
Of course, yeah.
Sound like you guys are incredibly just breadth and depth of stuff. It's a
Yeah.
complete service. That's amazing.
Right, yeah, we've tried to cover all the bases.
That's great. Question.
A question, virtual staging,
Of course.
are we required? I thought we were required to put it on the photo for MLS.
Yeah, so it
Are we?
will say that it's a virtually staged
Okay.
photo. And so we don't, and with a lot of the editing, most of the editing is like just kind of optimizing the light in the first place, because you're not allowed to go and create something that's not there. Like you can't pull up to a house and there's a completely manicured lawn with all these hedges and everything, and it's just dirt,
Correct.
So it's really about optimizing the lighting, but in the case of virtual staging, where we are inserting objects, it will give you that disclaimer.
And Bob, is that required with MLS?
Not required.
There, it's not required. Okay,
Right.
optional, okay. That's
Right.
good. That's all I
But it's good that he knows the compliance rules, so that's
Right.
good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Of course, and when we turn our return the work back to you, what we do is we give you two sets of photos. So we give you the full, like data rich file, the large photos, and then we do the MLS, which is the MLS compliant photos, which is the right dimensions for the local.
Great.
the
Tell us about the
local.
copyright issue.
So it's not like wedding photography where we own the photos or anything. You guys own the photos. So you don't have to lease it back. It's yours forever,
Okay.
That's good.
So we don't do
Use
it
it in
either.
our marketing.
Yeah, of course. It's all yours. And we do realtor intro, outro videos, and we do all kind of branded work too, but
Okay.
our core work is all MLS compliant.
Perfect. Good job. Any other questions? Excellent. Brian, it's very impressive.
Perfect. Nice to meet
Thank
you.
you.
and
Appreciate it.
Thank you for your time, you guys. And I brought some stuff back there that would.
Thank you. One more question. Are you local franchise?
So it's a local franchise. So we've got all of DFW, and we actually have the Hill Country area, San Antonio and Austin.
Okay,
But it's the corporation it's a Canadian corporation.
okay.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you. So how do we get our Zoom people back up?
I think we only have one up there,
Well, yeah,
Okay. well, And
I don't know.
I see Paul, so that's it.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, so let's go through and look at this
We're here.
quiz.
Oh, there's somebody else there too. So
Okay.
they're not all up there. Do you want me to get,
Get Kelsey or somebody in or Max to make sure that we open it up.
We can see you.
Well, thank you for that. But we want to be able to see you and know that you're, thank you for being here. And I'm looking forward to your, wise and timely comments on the quiz. So while she's come, get back and go through this, question number one. Seller doesn't need to exclude items that are not attached to the property such as fireplace screen. Since these are personal items and don't go with the property unless the buyer includes them in a non-realty item addendum. What do you guys think? True or false?
I look forward to looking at it.
See our fine Zoom folks, both of them. Yeah.
There's 12.
Oh, 12. Well, I would especially like to see them then. All right,
Now there's 14.
wonderful. Well, thank you. It's good. So what was our, and Zoomers, did you hear that first question? Give me a
Yes.
thumbs
Yes.
up, okay? So what's the answer, true or false?
False.
False.
Everybody agrees false? Why is it false?
Because if a fireplace screen is made for the fireplace, it is.
What if it's not? What if it's not attached? What if it's not customized? What if it's not?
Well, I have
Want
no
to make sure
idea.
the parties understand what it is they think they're getting or not getting.
Pardon me?
Want to make sure that the buyer understands what they're getting or not getting.
Okay, how would the buyer understand that?
You have to explain to them that if they
Uh,
want it, they need to put it in contract.
Oh, well, what if it's already in the contract? Like in paragraph 2B or 2C? Fireplace screens are in 2C.
Yeah.
Specific wording. So doesn't that stay?
Yes.
Let's seller excludes it, it stays. Just says fireplace screen, doesn't say customized, doesn't say attached, just fireplace screens. Some people will use the 3-step picture thing, saying, well, this is, whatever. But the reality is, it's on the list. So the key to the concept, question 1, is the agent needs to understand how we define the property in paragraph 2. And how 2A is the legal description. 2B are all improvements, 2C are the accessories. And 2D is where the seller gets excluded. And if the seller has not excluded anything, then everything in 2B and 2C goes with the property. But you need to know what's there. Because, and you need to be listening to your buyer, because when your buyer's walking through the house and talks about something in the property, say, wow, boy, that's great, we're gonna love that, we're gonna really enjoy that, whatever that is. You need to know whether that's included in paragraph 2 or not. And you need to be able to have that conversation. If there's any question, you need to say to your buyer, says, you know what? You need to make sure the contract reflects what you think you're gonna get. One of the things we also need to help the buyer understand, we have no control over what the seller does. Short of armed guards frisking everybody when they move, we have no way of controlling what they take. We presume that they're gonna obey what's in the contract as they go through the process. But so, sellers have crazy thoughts about, I can't believe you thought I'd leave this. Whatever that might be. I always take that. That's not part, that's ours, I said, well, but those custom drapes in the master bedroom that match it like that. It's right there in the contract. Drapes are there. Drapes are listed. So unless you exclude those matching drapes, stays. And they just, there's some things, by the way, that you won't even think about until it happens to you, and then you'll think about it.
A tree.
Like a tree, like shrubbery. Well, is that fall under the category when we talk about things, like shrubbery? Is that part of that, where we deal with all those types of things? Is that part of landscaping? We got shrubbery, we got landscaping, all that to be. Is that part of that? Well, that could be open for dispute, couldn't it? What about light bulbs? One of our agents had the buyer, big house, Lakeside on Preston, like $2 million deal. The seller took all of the light bulbs. It hit the fan. It was a challenge.
Isn't that something you have to replace?
Well, I don't know. He said, well, they weren't really attached. We just unscrewed them, took them. But they really were kind of attached. Well, we didn't have to take a screwdriver to it or do, anything. It was just, and, the bottom line was buyer was really unhappy about it, so I thought they could do it. And so we ended up in a dispute and on $2 million piece of property, everybody knows attorneys. And so attorneys got involved and went down, the Fat Happy Road. Now, the thing that happened in that is the buyer's agent who deals with a lot of luxury properties says, I never would have thought of it. I never would have thought about this, but I will on the next deal. Because every transaction you do changes what you do on the next transaction. Because people do crazy things. Who would think to take the light bulbs? Now, as it turns out, as we get to the story behind the story, the buyer and the seller were not on the best of terms. And the seller just did it out of spite. Because they were really hacked off at the buyers.
Probably took those little things in the toilet paper rolls too.
Yeah. Probably took all the toilet paper. Because, certain things you expect when you move into a house and you say, well, it should be whatever. So the concept in paragraph 1, I mean, it is false, but the concept of dealing with it is you need to know what the parties have agreed to in paragraph 2, because everything in paragraph 2 deals with the property. You define the property. And the legal concept is whatever the seller owns is conveyed in the sale unless they exclude it. So you need to know what the sellers agreed to. So when you take that listing, you're going to walk through the property. And you're going to talk to the seller and say, okay, tell me about anything you want to take with you. Whatever it might be. And sometimes they'll be like, I can't believe you think I'd leave that. Geez, what do you got? It's crazy to learn about that. And so you go through that process, you do it, and you make sure that it's reflected in the contract, whatever it is that they want to end up with, that it's reflected there. Otherwise, if one of our objectives in a transaction is to avoid disputes. Anything we can do to make the contract be clearer in its communication between the buyer and the seller about what they've agreed to do, anything we can do is going to minimize the potential disputes. Yes, ma'am.
Is it good practice to have a homeowner replace a chandelier that they plan on taking with them with another light fixture before photography?
Yeah, it's a great question, Annie. Chandeliers, we've had a little bit of a history with chandeliers. In that, especially beautiful custom chandeliers. And the seller swaps out the chandeliers and puts that gosh awful builder chandelier in there. Our challenge is, one of the things in the contract is in paragraph 10, we're talking about possession. Where seller delivers possession on its present condition. Well, that's what's going on the day of the contract. The two parties enter a contract. So if the custom chandelier is there on that day, it needs to be there when the seller delivers possession. The problem is we rarely are at the house on the day it's a contract. We tend to rely on a few days later when we're doing inspections, what's there. And people aren't paying attention. Now, something like a custom chandelier that the buyers really are keyed on, they're going to notice that it's not there when they get there 4 days later. Then they've got to fight the battle of proving whether or not it was there on the day they entered into the contract or not. And that creates a challenge. So having the conversation, going with your question here, if you've got a custom chandelier there, if you've got the seller, make sure you have the conversation. You're going to convey this property with that custom chandelier because the buyers made a big deal about one of the reasons they're buying this house. They do a lot of entertaining. And that custom chandelier really sets off that formal dining area. And that's a big deal to them. In fact, there's another house in the same subdivision right down the street that's very similar, they really like, but the chandelier made the difference. And so if your seller is intending to take it, you ought to have that conversation. In all fairness, they need to get it out of there. I think you're right, before photographs, before they enter into a contract, because then they've got a potential dispute. Same thing with the buyers. If the buyers are in a situation where that chandelier is really important to them, the buyer might want to look at some language in paragraph 11, making sure that that chandelier and the attached photograph identifying it very specifically is the one that gets conveyed. Because, you know, some items in a house are incredibly important to the parties. And you want to make sure that the contract reflects whatever that might be. Makes sense? Yeah, good question. So are we good with all the pieces of paragraph one? What's the real lesson for for question one? You need to know what's in paragraph two. And this is one of those cases that this is a combination of memorization and the concept. You know, I'm not a fan of memorization. I think you need to understand the concept. The concept is an agent needs to know what the parties are agreeing to convey in paragraph two. And 2A, you need to know the difference between 2A and 2B, and between 2B and 2C. 2B, permanently installed and built-in items. 2C, if it's there, if it's on the list, it's safe. Unless you exclude it in 2D. Okay, any questions from the Zoomers before we go to question two? Everybody good with the concept?
If a buyer sees it, a buyer wants it.
Do what?
If a buyer sees it, a buyer wants it.
Yeah, and the agent needs to listen to the buyer about things that are important to the buyer and make sure that it gets included in contract, don't they?
Correct.
Yep. Okay, question two. You should always talk to your buyer on a conventional loan about their choices on the financing contingency. Okay, so I hear false. So first of all, help me understand, what do I mean by the choices on financing contingency? And when you look at the third-party financing addendum, in fact, we're talking about financing, tells me this is not a cash transaction. So there's some type of borrowed money. And so in the third-party financing addendum, right there in paragraph 1A, where it talks about 1A, 1B, C, D, E, F, and then G, the hard money thing, these are the choices. These are the things that the buyer could choose to do. And your buyer is sitting there thinking, well, I don't know, I might do an FHA or I might do a conventional. Well, those are choices for your financing contingency. And those choices will create a different situation for the buyer as far as qualifying, as far as going through the process. Also, if a buyer makes an offer with FHA or VA financing, it's going to be viewed differently by a seller than a conventional loan. And so the buyer needs to know, here are the choices that different contingencies that you need to consider and decide which one you want. And they'll do that with advice from two persons. One, the agent saying, here's how your offer may be viewed by the other side of this market. And we're in a multiple offer situation or we're not. You're the first warm body to show them 6 months, so you got a lot of leverage here. The other person you talk to is the lender. So the lender can say, here's the difference between conventional financing today or FHA financing or VA financing, or if it qualifies, you may even find yourself dealing with a USDA loan or something else. So the lender can help them understand, here are the differences. Here's the different costs, here's the different rates, here's the different qualifying process. And that's something that, pardon me?
Timeliness on how fast.
Yeah, how long is it gonna take to get it done? So the timing of that, so that's gonna be a good conversation the buyer has with their lender as you go through that process. So I think you do need to have that conversation with the buyer about their choices. Because it's not automatic, it's gonna always be one thing. It's not gonna always be a conventional or always be an FHA. There are choices as you go through it. And these choices all roll down into paragraph 2A, buyer approval. And the timing of that. And so the buyer needs to make sure they've talked to their lender about the timing of buyer approval, not loan approval, not property approval, but just the buyer approval. And they're say, well, based on what information I have on you right now, type of borrower you are, you know, we get this done in 2 weeks, or this is going to take 30 days or whatever. That's going to be a conversation. And so the timeline the buyer has in buyer approval is going to be based on what their lender tells them as you go through that. And then the property approval, there's going to be different property approval process in a conventional loan versus an FHA or VA. They look at it a little bit differently. And so your buyer needs to be familiar with all those factors that come into play as they're trying to decide, here's the type of financing that we're going to do.
The house,
Pardon?
the condition of the house.
Sure.
Looking at the house. Will depend on everything.
Oh, absolutely. Because, you know, the more challenging condition issues we have, more of a challenge for FHA and VA, especially VA. So we gotta work through and deal with those types of things. So does everybody understand that why question 2 is actually true? Everybody good with why, numbers, are you good with that, why it's true?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Question 3. In a short sale, as you represent the buyer, you don't need to worry about the utilities since the seller has to have them on during the entire time of the contract according to 7A of the contract. True or false? So is it not true that paragraph 7A addresses utilities have to be on your entire term of the contract? Is that actually in 7A? Why is this false?
You don't know what the seller knows what they're gonna do.
Okay, so the concept of a short sale is we already know up front, the seller doesn't have to have enough money to even pay off the first lien. So there's a financial challenge on the seller side. We'll see another question where we talk about seller having to bring money to closing, it's a different thing. But on a short sale, while contractually, the seller has agreed to have utilities on during the entire term of the contract. It's silly for the buyer to waive the contract, say, you notice right here, 7A, yeah. And so said, you notice right here, I don't have any money. Which part of I don't have any money did you miss here? And so the buyer and the seller have to make sure they negotiate the transaction to take into consideration the financial situation. And it may well be that the agents have to work something out to make sure utilities on, because without utilities on, this inhibits the buyer's inspections. And so we got to do it. When we find ourselves having to deal with this in institutional sales, HUD properties, where the utilities may not be on, and HUD requires the buyer's broker to pay to have utilities turned on so they can do all these things. So as we look through this, the reality is you do need to worry about it. Saying you don't need to worry about it, that's false. You do need to worry about it. Because if you don't have any money, he doesn't have any money. If he's got a $900 electric bill, you just can't pay it. So it doesn't do any good to say, well, technically, you say, well, technically, you're an idiot. So work with me on that. Everybody, any questions on 3? Zoomers, we good? On why you really have to pay attention to that? One of the concepts of all these questions that come through is there's always something behind the surface of the question. Is we need to remember as agents, there are practical aspects of what's going on in the transaction. And one of the practical aspects we need to understand is what the contract is in the first place. It's a series of promises between the buyer and the seller. In fact, that is the consideration of the contract. That's that promise to exchange something of value. And the reality is, if either party chooses not to perform as they've agreed to, nothing automatically happens. It takes the other side to take action. So when our buyer, one of our agents' buyer was in a contract and moving towards closing in a few weeks, the seller decided to sell the house to another buyer and into a contract. And we didn't find out until after the fact they not only entered into a contract with another buyer, they closed on, while in contract with our buyer. Our buyer was furious, just, I'm gonna get attorneys and da. You know what happened? Nothing happened. The buyer finally decided it wasn't worth it. Fortunately, the seller released earnest money and they moved on into another deal. And the seller absolutely had no rights to do what they did. And if the wrong buyer was showing up here and decided to sue them, not only was the seller have a problem, the second buyer had a problem. And then all kinds of challenges. But unless somebody chooses to do something, if somebody chooses to not perform as they promised in the contract, nothing automatically happens. Somebody has to take action. And then it all comes with what they choose to do in paragraph 15. Right?
So during the high seller market frenzy, I think it was Carol Thompson or maybe a group that came up with the questionnaire. This is like if you've got the buyers and You know, or your, yes, you've got the listing and the buyers that are, you know, all fighting over your listing. There was a questionnaire we came up with.
Questionnaire for the seller,
Questionnaire for the
buyer,
buyers.
okay,
That are putting contract offers in. Are you currently under contract with any other,
okay.
uh,
Some of the things on my list, of things you've got to ask. Every seller, every buyer.
so they
Are
were.
you currently in contract on others? Have you terminated contracts on others?
Yes,
All those questions. So you ask all those now. Keep going,
well, we put it in the transaction desk
okay?
address and they had to sign it
Yeah,
because people were
and
falling out and doing that.
sure, absolutely. And we hope that you tell us the truth when they answer it. Understanding that they don't have to answer any of those, but that you don't have to accept their offer as you go through the process. You know, it's hard to protect against the big lie, but we hope that they're in fact taking it. And it's really, you're showing the seller that you're doing everything you can to make sure this is a legitimate buyer. Because there are big red flags if the buyer is in other contracts same time, there are reasons why they may be. Or they terminated the last 3 contracts, or you know what their circumstances are. So these are all legitimate things as we represent the seller to kind of protect them from being in a contract with a buyer who's blatant. It's not really, their intentions are not good. So that is a good thing. We have to remember, it's only as good as the other side is willing to step up and provide good information. It's just like we understand a buyer is not required to tell a seller they have a house to sell. We don't have that contingency, but they're not required to tell. And if you ask them, as you should, and one of the questions on that thing should have been, do you buyer have a house to sell? They don't have to tell you. Now, they can't lie to you if you ask the question, but they don't have to tell you. It's just like there are things that we presume have to be done. Your seller is in a contract and another buyer shows up and they want to make an offer and seller into a second into a backup contract. There's no obligation of the seller to tell the buyer in the first contract that they now have a backup. But it would be a good thing for the buyer. No, but there's no requirement to do that unless the seller feels like it's to their advantage. So there are all kinds of things you work through it that make good sense, and a questionnaire like that makes good sense. So, Zoomers, were you able to hear enough of the conversation, my answers, to get a concept of what Diane was talking about?
Yes.
Thumbs up, good. Okay, perfect. Okay, so question 4. Represent the seller and buyer makes an offer on October 10th with a closing date of December 15th. The conversation you should have is, and here we've got 4 choices, so let's look at it. A, the likelihood of the property not appraising for the sales price. B, the right of the seller to require an appraisal early in the deal. C, the right of the parties to limit, the paragraph should say 2A, not 2A1, 2A, contingency timeline on the buyer being approved by the lender. D, right to negotiate earlier closing date. Is everybody clear that in this example, October 10th contract, for the closing date December 15th, that's a long time frame. Your seller is really at risk, not just for the time frame, but the time of the year. If this deal falls apart, December 15th is a terrible time for them to put the house back on the market. So one, from a seller standpoint, you need to have a conversation with the seller as you go through the process to consider some things you might want to do with this buyer. One, why do they need that much time? So you might want to see if you can consider a different closing date. So why do they need to wait till the now? They maybe need to wait because that's the timing of the move of where they are now. There may be legitimate reasons, but it's still a challenge because that's a long time frame to work through and deal with it. The concept of we don't want to wait till the last minute to find out about the appraisal, remembering that we cannot make the lender, we cannot require an earlier appraisal of the lender because they're not a party to the contract. We can require to the buyer. So I can say to the buyer that you need to produce an appraisal to the seller within 15 days effective the contract or whatever the time frame is. You can't require that of the lender, who's not a party to the contract. Require that of the buyer. as you work through that. The contingency timeframe, it's interesting, even when things were hot and heavy year and a half ago, we typically would see the buyer approval timeframe being a reasonable timeframe. 10, 15 days, 20 days, something like that. But occasionally you would see 30 days. You would see a time frame that was always closing. And if the listing agent's not paying attention, that's a challenge situation. If you had the buyer approval timeframe here that went all the way to that December 15th date, that's really bad for the seller. Like it literally at the last minute, the buyer could be out of that deal and the seller doesn't get the earnest money just because of the financing contingency. So we agree that we need to have some conversation. Your understanding of the big picture, your understanding of whether or not this is a really good buyer, otherwise, there's just some details that we need to work out. Your understanding of how your seller's negotiating position is. They're in a good position. They've got a lot of leverage, or they don't have any leverage. It's been a really hard house to sell. And this is the first one body show up 6 months. We just hope the deal works. So that's your information that you bring to your client. So here's what's going on. Here's what you need to consider as you think through that. That makes semi sense. So which of these you think is the best answer? I think it's easy. You probably deal with a combination of several of these.
I have a problem with A.
You have a problem with A?
Got a trick word in there. One of your
Okay,
trick words is in there.
Yeah,
And what's the trick word?
Likelihood. That means you think it's not, did you mean possibility?
Is there a difference?
A huge difference. to me.
What's the difference?
Likelihood?
Yep.
You're making it sound like it's not gonna price.
Yeah, I can
it's
see that.
likely it's not going to appraise.
It sounds like you're a
versus
little more than negative
impossible.
side.
So the likelihood is a negative phrase?
To me, it is.
Oh, that's interesting.
You said likelihood.
And this is a great example of how wording means something different to different people. When I pull through the fast food and I want to get me one of the breakfast sandwiches, I like crispy bacon. I like it crispy. And if I say I want extra crispy bacon, they may think I'm asking for more bacon. Because I want crispy bacon as opposed to extra crispy. So words we use can make a difference. Now, frankly, I never thought about likelihood being a negative phrase. And I see that you like having something, that possibility being a better word. You see possibility being a more positive word. That's interesting.
Or
Never
more
thought about that.
impartial. Because if you're saying the likelihood of this selling is not higher, the likelihood,
That's interesting.
yeah.
You can also say that with possibility.
Possibility, yeah.
But
Well,
that's
there's
not
a
neutral, that's
possibility
likelihood.
of this happening or
Yeah.
that happening, but there's a likelihood of this happening.
That's interesting. I've never had anyone bring that up before. I'm not surprised, Larry, that you.
I thought you did it on purpose to try to trick me.
No, I didn't, because I really hadn't thought about the different interpretation of likelihood. This will change how I view it in the future. In fact, I'll probably change the language.
No, keep it in there.
Maybe not
Start
keep it in there so we can
talking
talk about it.
Yeah.
Everybody agree though that E is probably our best answer there.
Yes.
Okay. 5. You should talk to the buyer about survey deletion. Only on an existing survey since they don't need it on a new survey. I think, true or false?
Oh, the word deletion was very.
Yeah, I didn't know what you meant by survey deletion.
Okay, so let's talk about survey deletion. Where does it show up in the contract? And admittedly, you don't actually see the phrase deletion, survey deletion. So this concept of this, where does it show up in the contract?
6A.
6A8. So on page 2 of the contract there, in 6A, you have 9 standard printed exceptions. So when the buyer gets their title insurance policy, these 9 items will be listed. The title company is saying to the buyer, you have no coverage in your title insurance policy for any of these items. You've got a problem with them, don't call us, we can't help you. Number 8, and number 8 deals with the survey. And also deals with, as you work through the situation and discrepancies. So So in number 8, the title company gives the buyer the ability to amend this exceptions and to take some of this exception away, leaving certain things. So when you look at the standard for an exception, discrepancies, conflicts, shorts in area, boundary lines, encroachments, protrusions, overlapping improvements. If the buyer amends this, then the new language in that section of their title insurance policy will simply say, shortages in area. All the rest of those items will go away. The title company is now saying, if you've got a problem, for example, with overlapping improvements, encroachments, boundary lines, if that's your problem, mistakes on the survey, and that's your problem, if you've amended this, you can file a claim. Whether you win or not, who knows, but at least you can file a claim. But if your problem is the exact square footage of the land, you don't get to file a claim, because that exception will still be. Now, you should do this on both existing and new surveys, certainly on existing. Because on an existing survey, if there's a mistake on the survey, buyer has no recourse against the survey. If it's a new survey, the buyer has recourse against the survey. It was made for that buyer. Now, the reason that you might do this on a new survey is many survey shops are small shops and people die and retire and they're gone. And if they're gone, you have no recourse unless you've amended this, then you can go with the title company, which the deep pockets will still be there. Now, this is an easy, simple thing. Depending on the circumstance of the transaction, it's my feeling the buyer should always do this. I mean, they're offering 10,000 more than the list price, and they're worried about a small amount like this. The cost of doing this is 5% of the premium for the title policy. So if your title policy costs $2,000, it costs the buyer $100 to make this amendment. Maybe just check that off. So, well, it's a house in the middle of a subdivision, so what could possibly go wrong? Well, mistakes on surveys. Mistakes on surveys do happen. I've personally, over many years on properties, have filed claims, mistakes on surveys. But granted, especially in today's world, the technology has gotten so much better with surveys. It's less likely, particularly in an established subdivision. But it's so cheap. So, why not do it? The reason buyers don't typically do it is the agent doesn't know how to explain it. They say, oh yeah, this is that changes the title policy, it's an amendment kind of thing. Yeah, you ought to go ahead and do that. We'll just check it and you ought to pay for it. So, because you want to make an attractive offer and the seller feel really good about your offer because you're paying for everything. So I think you ought to go ahead and do it. And you're in big trouble when buyers, well, explain how that works again. And then Larry said, well, let me give you Marcia's number. Let her explain it to you.
Every time.
So, do you see though, that, 5 is false, because you do it on both new and existing surveys. Any questions, numbers on 5? We good? 6. You should have a conversation with your buyer about uses or activities they are considering after they own the property. To consider inserting in paragraph 6D objections. What do you think? You're true or you're false?
True.
Okay, so tell me about that. What's the conversation you're going to have with your buyer?
I'm putting a swimming pool.
Swimming pool, for example.
You want to fence your yard.
Daycare. You're going to use it as a rental property, detached garage,
Use it for home health care.
home health care,
Shed.
shed.
It says after they own the property.
Yeah, so, well, yeah, because here's the key. Buyers in the process, they like the property, they're gonna make an offer.
Yeah.
And in that offer, in paragraph 6D, you got a big blank.
I guess I misinterpreted, I after would be too late,
Yeah,
I would put something on 6 feet before you did the offer.
well, but you're gonna put that before it, but what we want them to think about is, once you own the property, what are you gonna do with it? What are the things you're talking about, like a pool? Well, big backyard, we want to build a pool. Okay, well, let's make sure you can do that. So in the offer, we're gonna do it, but it's what they're thinking about doing. Now, we don't know everything over the next 30 years, but they've been thinking about certain kinds of things. And it creates that right of objection they otherwise wouldn't have. Because the thing that gets in the way of pools are easements. And easements is one of those things you cannot object to. Unless you put something in the big blank. So I understand your concept, but at the time they're making the offer, if they're thinking about after they own the property, what are things they want to do? Now is when they're gonna work an objection. Or a possibility of rejection, right?
So
If they want to rent the property.
Yeah, want to use it as a rental.
And they already bought the property and they can't rent it right away.
Well, that's why they're gonna put it in the offer, but one of the things they're talking about is we're gonna buy this property as an investment property. And so we wanna know before we close on it whether we can do that or not. And-
Before they annex.
Yeah.
I know, and I read it the same way too, other than what they are considering.
Okay, so how would you change the language? Because what you're looking at is putting something in here, things that they want to do with the property. Now, can they do anything with the property until they own it? No. I'm not sure how you would change the language, because what we're looking at is the buyer establishing a right of objection if there are things they want to do, they can't do it. And here's a part of the contract where you would put that. Diane?
question, so I had a buyer, gonna put a pool in. The seller had pool previously and they didn't have a survey, they had buried the pool. Not had it properly demolished.
Didn't have it removed.
No, they didn't have it removed, they just filled in all the dirt and everything. And so that causes,
Because probability of new pool.
yeah, a lot more expense, because they gotta go in and do what the seller should have done.
Is that something the seller should have disclosed?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
But often they won't. I mean, frankly, maybe it wasn't, they weren't the one that did, it was a previous owner. And frankly, they'd forgotten about it. Maybe they did it and they forgot about it. This, that's 10 years ago, geez. We still need to talk about that. But here's our challenge. One, regardless of the conversation that this is having about timing of it, what the buyer is thinking about is, here's how I want to own this property. Here's how I want to be able to use this property as a rental with a pool, with a detached garage, here's how I want to own this property. So the buyer says, how do I make sure that if I find out I can't do this thing, I can object? And if that can't be changed, then I can terminate the contract, get my earnest money back. So the buyer is thinking, in writing this offer, what's my process? Where will I address this thing that I want to do once I own the property? So the timing of creating this right to object has to be in the offering process. We all agree with that? That makes sense. So we're just thinking about, I mean, one of the things is, you really do need to have that conversation. Tell me what you're thinking about doing in the house. Or with the property. Now, there's another side to this. If the buyer does have something they want to do, maybe an investment property. They need to understand that when they put that in there, it creates a right of objection. And it creates zero obligation of the seller. Buyer can't say, well, I've got the objection here that I want to use it as investment property. It turns out I can't do that. Seller, I'm objecting, seller's got to take care of that. Seller's got to fix it so I can do that. No obligation on the seller.
When they get the HOA docs,
What?
when they get the HOA docs, they have.
Well, if it's in a match or HOA and they get those docs, they have that. Whether you put anything in here or not, you still have the HOA doc issue. Once they receive the HOA docs, they've got 3 days to terminate for any reason.
That you put, Steve.
Well, the two are independent of each other. We don't tie those two together. So if he wants to use it as investment property and he puts that in there, and then remembering that the buyer's got to do the research. And let's say it's not in a match or HOA, but there are other challenges that keep them using it as an investment property. You know, maybe the city has got some issues there. We need to keep in mind, with or without a mandatory HOA, this is simply the buyer saying, I want to create a right to object. And the seller has no obligation on any level to do anything to cure the objection. And it's important to remember, this is totally a buyer's obligation to determine if this thing that I want to do, if it can't be done, I get to object, and then if the seller can't do anything or won't do anything, I can terminate and get my earnest money back.
I have a follow-up on that.
Pardon me?
I have a follow-up on that. You said the seller has no right to cure the.
No, I didn't say right. I said no obligation.
No, okay, the seller has
Big
no
difference.
obligation to cure the objection.
Yeah.
Does the seller have any responsibility to investigate?
Nope. None whatsoever. Seller
No
has,
obligation at all.
seller has zero. Look at the language, 6D. We were talking about buyer must object earlier. We're going to talk about the blank, the small blank, as you go through the process. So we've got the challenge here. Says, you know, we're talked about sellers objecting and selling through the process. And talk a little bit about sellers saying, but when under the small blank, when you go 1, 2, 3, 4 lines down, the line says scheduled to the amendment are not waived by buyer. It says provided seller is not obligated to incur any expense. Seller shall cure any timely objection and has a time frame there, 15 days. Any expense. Seller says, well, you know, I can send a letter to the county to fix this problem, but stamps have really gotten expensive. So I'm not gonna do it. He's not required. Seller is not required to do anything, not required to investigate it, not required to decide whether he can or cannot cure it. He's not required to do anything, and that's been proven over and over and over again. Seller has no obligation. It's totally, all the buyer is doing is creating a right of objection. And then depending on what happens after the buyer makes the right of objection, then certain things have to happen. Now, there are timelines in here that it's important for us to understand. The buyer's timing for the right to object is tied to the small blank. And the small blank always has to have a number in there, and it's never 0 and it's never blank. As a minimum, you have a dispute. So it should be a number of days, even if it's 1 day or 3 days or 5 days, whatever the time frame is. That's how much time the buyer has to object or closing, whichever's earlier. Buyer does not get to extend closing date for the objection time frame. So the buyer gets the last of the 3 documents, amendment, exception, document, survey. 1 day before closing, he's got 1 day. However, when the buyer objects, the seller has 15 days to decide if he's going to do anything or not. And that 15 days can extend the closing. And once the 15 days comes and goes, as you work through the process, if they're not object here, buyer may, liberty to seller with 5 days, 5 days after the end of the cure period, terminate contract, waive the objection. If buyer does not terminate within that 5 days after the 15 days, he's deemed to have accepted. So he's got a timeline after that 15 days, this is the cure period. He's got a timeline that he's got to make a decision. He's going to accept that whatever the problem is, he's going to go ahead and buy the house, or he's going to terminate. That's a 5-day time frame after, and that's new in this contract. We didn't used to have that. So that's an important timeline for you to be aware of, that if your buyer does have a situation. The overriding thing here, though, is the impact of what the buyer puts in the big blank. Because this is going to cloud the offer. So it needs to be something that's serious, that's real. The buyer says, yeah, if I can't do this, I'm not going to buy this house. I want to be able to do this, whatever this is. So the buyer needs to make sure that whatever that is important, and it goes in the big blank. But don't just be putting something in there to be putting something in there, because it's going to cloud the offer. The seller may look at it like a weasel clause, just wait for the buyer to get out. Just be careful as you do that. Don't just casually, please don't put residential use in there.
Or can you put a residential rental use?
paperwork back here, can you use what?
Can you put like for residential rental? use? Because in the event that docs say that you have to wait a year before you can purchase it
Yeah.
and rent it,
So,
then who wants to lose revenue?
so the buyer can put in there that he wants to be used as residential rental use, but it's gonna be the buyer's decision to determine if he can do that or not. If it's in a Mantua HOA,
Right, so we get-
okay, but now, we got two different timeframes.
right,
Maybe you've got 5 days in the small blank and 6D. So he's got 5 days after receiving the docs, the last of the 3 documents, under this provision. The mandatory HOA docs, he may not get them for 10 or 15 days. Then he's got 3 days after that. So those are 2 independent rights with 2 different timelines. But, you know, if the buyer, but the real key here, and I want to emphasize this, you've had this happen twice here and once in Rockville, where the agent misunderstood what the buyer gained when they put something in here to object to. And they allowed the buyer to close. And in one case, exactly what you just said, they found out they had to own it for a year before they could rent it. Here we've got a buyer who's closed on the property, owns the property, and can't rent it for a year.
I have a question. 100% the buyer's obligation?
100% the buyer's obligation, except,
Not the buyer's.
okay, let me finish. Except you have a fiduciary duty to your client. Make sure they understand, here's what you're doing, you're creating a right of objection. And by the way, you, the buyer, in a mandatory HOA, you've got to talk to the HOA people. You've got to read the HOA docs. I don't want you reading that 60 pages of HOA docs and interpret, not a track document. You need to make sure they read them, they look at them. Any questions, they talk to the HOA, they go through the process, you want your buyer to do that. Now, that's ideal. There's certain times your buyer just won't do it. Can't do it, you know. One of our agents has some lovely buyers from Japan who can't read or write English. So it'd be of no use to send them a title or the HOA doc because they can't read it. So what we got to do is say, yeah, okay, you've got to find somebody there who can interpret for you because we, the agent, we cannot do that. And that's a challenge. And we've got some of those unique challenges with foreign buyers. We work through it. But it's a challenge. You've got the fiduciary duty to make sure your buyer understands. Because in all 3 of the cases I just mentioned, the agent misunderstood the obligation. They thought the seller had an obligation to make sure this could happen. And they allowed their buyer to go ahead and close on the transaction. And they found out after the fact. And in all cases, all 3 mandatory HOAs, and they received the docs. And they missed the part about ownership. In fact, it was one of those things that the one that was 60 pages. In the very first page, it appeared like it was okay to rent the property. On page 35, there was a section that talked about ownership for 1 year. So we've got to make sure we understand where the obligation, but all these obligations of our clients, understand what they agreed to, fall on us. The trick says your fiduciary duties are to make sure your client understands what they've agreed to. And you got to do that without practicing law.
what, I forwarded to the title attorney.
If the title attorney will help you in that, that's great.
That's what we did.
Perfect.
Double checked it, triple checked.
Now, what you want is that title company, a title attorney to talk to your client.
Yeah.
Not you. Because then when you say, well, here's what Kelly said, here's what John said, here's what Brandy said, here's what they said in the situation. And you somehow misheard it, we've got a problem. So have them talk, that's a great solution. If you can get the title company people to help you out, that's perfect. Yeah. Yeah, oh, absolutely. It's a great thing.
I addressed it up front and I told him what the issue was. And so as soon as he got the HOA docs, which took a while to get.
Yeah.
He scanned it, whatever, how attorneys do, scanned it,
Yeah.
that worded. Several
That's
times.
for keywords.
Yes, whatever it is. And it was like 400 pages.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
It was.
Yeah. Something that, one, you can't. Second, you should never take the time, energy, and whatever to try to review 400 pages. That's why they went to law school. You had a question?
So if you have an objection for rental use and you have, let's say, 3 days underneath in there. And then, you have they are in a HOA. So you have the addendum for the property owners and they have 14 days to get those documents.
You know, what is that for property?
The POA addendum.
Oh, okay, for mandatory HOA.
Yes,
Okay.
mandatory HOA. And then say they have
You
14
checked off
days.
probably A1,
Yes, okay,
14 days. Okay.
14 days. And so 3 days go and the buyer can't find out whether they can rent the property or not and can't get their hands on the
HOA docs. yeah.
the HOA docs. Does the HOA docs, do they then have, they can still walk away 3 days
Yeah,
after?
separate right of termination.
Okay, so it
Yeah,
gives them
just
double
because-
coverage,
just-
kind of,
Well, it's independent coverage.
independent.
Because just because the time frame or 6D is passed does not affect the time frame for mandatory HOA.
Okay.
They don't stack on each other. They're two totally independent rights of objection and rights of termination.
Okay, thank you.
Zoomers, we have a follow-up on this? We see that there's a lot in 6 and in spite of just his challenge with after. But the concept is valid, right? And we do understand the concept of it.
Yeah.
So we do understand that everybody agrees that 6 is true. You see, there's always so much behind the surface of the question. And every one of these, we've had challenges, transactions in which we had a problem. So now that we interpret that. 7, depending on how the parties interpret paragraph 7A, a buyer may have the right to access the property without the presence of their agent. We think, true or false? Yeah, here or false? Well, look at 7A. You got the contract there. It says seller shall permit buyer and buyer's agent and buyer's agent, not buyer only with buyer's agent,
Yeah.
but and buyer's agent access, and talks about reasonable time. You can interpret, and we have had interpretation on both sides of this. Our preference, in fact, our policy is our buyer should never be at the property without an agent. The time that buyers show up at the property without an agent is when the inspector's there. Because otherwise, they don't have access to the property. So they need somebody who has access to the property that to go with. We don't like that. Inspectors don't like that. Because if they're trying to do a job and the buyer is stretched off. And the other problem is it's not just the buyer, it's their whole family, 11 kids and all that kind of stuff. And we've had this challenge, we've had this issue as we kind of work through it. It's we've tried to get broker lawyer to make this language clearer. The resistance is from the attorneys on the committee. Because there's a tendency that Trek doesn't want to tell principals what to do. Parties to the contract can do whatever they want to do. And so I said, yeah, but let's make it clear what the seller and the buyer are actually agreeing to do is allow the buyer access to the property, but then to have an agent with them. And Trek says, well, the buyer doesn't have an agent. Well, then how do they access the property? They have to make some schedule arrangement with the listing agent, access property. So there's some resistance on what we think should be better language. What we've got to do is that when you have a buyer client, right up front, when they're in a contract, you need to make sure they understand, hey, here's the deal. You only get to go to the property with an agent. And that'd be you, could be any agent in our office. Now, the other challenge with access is there's no reason for the access. There is no limitation on why. It can be for anything. And Lucid bless the house, contractors to show up, people to do interior design estimates and things like that. But the qualifier is reasonable time. Seller gets determined reasonable time. When I was doing a class Thursday in Rockwall, No, it wasn't. It was at a class yesterday. Over CCAR, contract class. And one of the students in the class, has the buyer and it's on a vacant property. And the buyer wants to access the property and have a contract to go out and get estimates, and the seller wouldn't let him go. That's not reasonable. And we tried to get him to understand the seller is gaining extra liability by getting in the way of the buyer's access to the property. And there's no excuse on a vacant property, anytime is reasonable. Well, it's not very well. Now, occupied property, absolutely, seller gets to determine reasonable time. But otherwise, this is a challenge. And we've got to make sure our buyer understands. That's the deal. Same thing with the seller. If you've got the listing and the buyer wants to access the property, your agent needs to go through the process, schedule the access to the property and go through that. We don't want the buyer to be there just with the inspector. And to the degree to which we can keep that from happening, we need to, but on the listing side, it's hard to control what the buyers do. They're gonna do what they're gonna do, but it is a risk, and it's a huge risk. So Nick back here grimacing like, Bob, yeah. But down that road, so what do you think? 7 is what? I think it's true because of the word may. I like the word may have the right. I think there's certainly, you could certainly,
It's been interpreted both ways, so.
has been interpreted by both ways. We've had both the buyer who showed up with the inspector. And we hadn't, at that time, we hadn't been as firm as we are trying to be now with, hey, here's our policy. But we've got to get out, put in our private page or something, a list of, here are our policies. Because we got a lot of quote unquote unofficial policies that not everybody knows about. And we did have the case, and I want to say, so several years ago, was one of Tommy Thompson's listing. And the buyer showed up, and it was their family. And the buyer's kids were playing with the seller's kids' toys, and the seller shows up early, or lost the listing. I mean, they just went ballistic. Because the buyer was there without an agent. They were there, the inspector was there, and the buyers just were doing all kinds of stuff. So we've been on both sides of that, and it's just be a real challenge. Because there's a certain expectation. I mean, and we work very hard to protect the privacy of the sellers on their property. But at the same time, the sellers understand there's a risk here. Because you're opening up to all kinds of people. So I think 7 is more appropriately true. 8, you should talk to your buyer about the amount of lender required repairs the seller could agree to pay for that keeps the contract alive and prevents the buyer from terminating even though the repairs are greater than an amount with which the buyer is comfortable. What are we talking about? First of all, we're talking about lender required repairs.
Yes.
Hello, Denton. How are you, sir?
I'm good, Bob.
So
I'm gonna learn.
myself, me too. We're looking at lender required repairs. Now, fortunately, the contract does a good job by titling paragraphs. And there's a paragraph at the top that says lender required repairs and treatments. So we would suspect that somewhere in paragraph 7E, we address this issue. So they're on page 5 of the contract, 7E, lender required repairs and treatments. Now, there's some interesting language. First thing, for the most part, lender required repairs are big items, foundation, roofs, no AC, whatever. There's something that probably came out of the appraisal, and the lender says, you know what? This isn't taken care of what I plan on. Lender required repairs. So unless they otherwise agree to it, either party's obligated to pay for it, which is against the instinct. Buyer says, well, it's your house. These are lender required repairs. You got to fix it or can't do the deal. So that, well, you know what? It's your lender. That's your problem. If they don't agree to it, notice what actually happens. Does it create a right of termination? Yeah. If you don't agree to it, contract will terminate. Or this money goes back to the buyer. And it may be a kind of implied right of termination for the buyer by not agreeing to something. Now, our challenge is, as we get down to the language, there's a number, 5%. 5% of the sales price. $800,000 house, $800,000 sales price. Lender required repairs come to $39,000. That's below the 5% figure. Seller says, no problem, I'll fix it all. Gotta fix it for somebody, I'll go and take care of it all. And the buyer goes, wow, 39,000 repairs. I don't know if I want a house that right up front, we got that kind of repairs going on. I don't think I want to do this deal. Well, it doesn't hit the 5% number. If seller agrees to fix it, under this particular paragraph, buyer doesn't have any right to get out. Now, if it's $41,000 in lender required and repairs, then the buyer say, well, I'm glad you're willing to do it, but I'm out of here, and they get terminated. Now, two challenges here. One, we don't have anything in the paragraph that says whose numbers we're going to use. So says, well, my numbers show 39,000. I says, well, my numbers show 41,000. I get out of the deal. Now we got a dispute between the parties. They got to negotiate. The other challenge is, and it's where you have to really do a little balancing act. You have to be very careful when you do this. You have a conversation with the buyer. Here's what you need to know. And maybe there's some things going on with the property that you think there's some big items that are going to come up. And so you're kind of already having that conversation. And you say to the buyer, says, okay, here's what you need to understand. Lender required repairs. There's a 5% figure here. But if the lender required repairs are less than that 5% figure, which in this example, $800,000 sales price would be 40,000. If it doesn't exceed that, then you can terminate the contract. But if it doesn't exceed, if it's less than that and the seller agrees to pay for it, you're still in the deal. And if your buyer says, whoa, I don't think so. I want to be able to get out of this deal way before we hit 40,000. You know, maybe I'd be okay with 15 or 20,000. The buyer and the seller can choose to change the number.
Percentage?
Change the 5 to 2 or 3. Now, you're not telling them to do it. We're treating it as a business detail. If your buyer says, I don't like that 5, and he lines through that, and in paragraph 11, special provisions, buyer and seller agree that the 5% percentage of the sales price for lender required repair shall be 2%. They get to make that change. Now, you're not ever going to bring it up or have that conversation without your buyer bringing it up. Your buyer says, wow, man, I don't know if I want this house for that kind of repairs. Okay, well, let's talk about how that might be changed. Because it can be. It's not statute. It's just terms of the contract. So they want to change that, they get to do that. I can see I scared Nick to death and he said, oh, I'm out of here on that one.
That's it. I'm actually quitting right now. Quitting the next track.
If they wanted to change that number, we'd have to go to you to kind of adjust that, or is that something that we can just like do a DocuSign?
If you got that unusual, well, you can do a doc. I mean, you probably, I don't know the technology side of this, with how you can do DocuSign or whatever. If you can change that number, DocuSign, or if all you're gonna do is go to special position, put the language in there. If you're gonna do it now, here's the thing. Anything we're putting in special provisions, you need something in writing, such as an email from your client saying, here's what I want you to put in the contract. Here's the language, here's what I want you to do. Now, we treat this as a business detail. It does not have to be attorney language, but it has to be something from our client. We don't get to do it on our own.
How many contracts have you seen terminate because of this paragraph?
Lender required repairs?
Yeah.
Back in the day, it was a regular thing. Because we used to have a situation where lenders, for whatever reason, were really scared. The underwriters were really bears on the big repairs.
Because it seems like
And most of it were foundations.
seems like most of those issues would have come up if they did an inspection. And would have been dealt with during the option period.
Sure.
It seems like it.
Could be, yeah. But sometimes, some inspectors don't go on the roof.
VA is strict. Sometimes they call things out.
Yeah. Most of it's gonna come from the appraisal. But it's gonna be some of the big items. But what we get into is some serious negotiation between the buyer and seller on getting this worked out. But what's important is both agents help the buyer and seller understand, here are the consequences. If you don't come to some agreement, here's what happens. Contract goes away. Now, one or both of them may be happy for that. Seller may be sitting there with a backup better than this one anyway, say, okay, yeah, go away, yep, I'm good with that, let's let it go away.
So will most title companies actually read the contract, or will they still require the seller to sign a release of the
They're
RC?
gonna require both parties to sign a release. Yeah. I don't have any that are different. The only time I have 90% of all the title companies do just one set of signatures during the auction. Pretty much everything else they require both, which is, by the way, wrong, shouldn't be the case. Yes, so. So everybody good with ages should be true? Everybody good? And how we go through the process, be really careful, like, if you get into that situation, it happens, call me. And let's talk about it, because I need to have a good sense of how that happened. 9, you must discuss with your buyer how to complete an effective repair request so the buyer has the best chance of being satisfied with the completion of repairs. What do you think? On the surface, that sounds pretty true, doesn't it? Well, but there are some things behind, there's some balances there. One, we have entire classes on language for repair requests. Because it's such a big deal. And it's done wrong so often. It uses vague terms. In spite of how many times I've said it. Which I probably said it a couple hundred times. Don't ever use the phrase HVAC must be evaluated and repaired or replaced as necessary. Terrible phrase, and we still see it. It's a terrible phrase for the buyer because it allows someone else to make the decision which should be repaired or replaced. We see the same thing with roofs, evaluate, repair, or replace. Roof, you have the insurance company, adjust, those not clear, not specific. So we should have the discussion. Now, in that discussion, which is an important conversation to have with your client, your buyer, and also, by the way, the sellers, we'll talk about in a minute. You need to make sure you're not the one that tells them what to say. You need to help them prioritize. Hopefully, most good inspectors who are doing their summary will give the buyer a good sense of here are things that are important for the function and or safety of the property. Here are things that you might want to really consider. As an agent, we're going to help them prioritize so that they don't overwhelm the seller in what they're negotiating or taking care of or doing. But we need to help the buyer think through this, recognizing you're going to have such a different perspective about how all this works. Inspection's done and you're there at the summary with the inspector and the buyer, and you're looking at the report, and you go, wow, that's not a bad report. Your buyer's over there just panic. How's it gonna fall down any minute now? It's terrible, but you've got a different perspective, so you've got to help them go through the process without convincing them all this is okay. It's not a problem. Don't worry about it. But you need to have that conversation because when they're looking at requesting repairs of the seller, they have certain things in mind that they think they want to accomplish. They think here's what we want the seller to agree to. We have to help them understand that it's not necessarily the case that the seller will see this thing as the same way the buyer is requesting. So we need to work through that. So you do need to have the conversation. We will have another class, probably not anytime this year, because we've got a bunch of other things to be doing. But we do have another question because it continues to be a challenge. And it's one of those things that we have to be very careful to make sure we're consulting and advising our clients so they can come up with good language to send to us so that we're not creating language. I still see on a regular basis language that's clearly agent language. It shouldn't be agent language. It should be something that comes from your client. Here's what I want to do. Now you can say, okay, here's the different examples of how you can ask for the AC to be repaired. Now here's some ways that you could do that. Here's some different ways you want the seller to clean this filthy house. Here's some different ways we can ask that. So you can go through, you can even give them examples. Go through that process. And I'm absolutely okay with you in a very respectful manner, looking at your buyer and saying, really? That's stupid. I can't believe you think that works. That's loser you are.
Part of that is educating.
I say that respectfully. You know what? You're one of the less stupid losers I've ever worked with. Yeah, like, Janet, by the way, hello. Good to see you. I haven't seen you since you moved over to the hinterland.
I'm just all
All over.
all my business has been that side of
Yeah.
the world. It's been great. So what I do on my buyer presentations is I go through what the seller's options are with all of the repairs. I kind of give them a idea, here are the things that are prioritized, so to speak. So I tell them about HVACs, plumbing and roofs and foundations. You know, any major safety issues, we're gonna be looking at first. And big ticket items. Then from there, we're gonna look at the systems, the HVAC system, plumbing system. you know, there's a
Electrical,
pool
all those,
system,
yeah.
whatever. And then I said cosmetic things are just cosmetic things. They won't determine whether this house sells or doesn't sell,
Yeah.
but if you kind of educate them up front and then remind them that once you give that inspection report, it goes a lot better.
And then you help them understand their negotiating position. You know, if they've gotten a great deal on this property, better than they ever thought they would get, then they're probably gonna be a little more flexible. As long as you're not any items that are really big to say, you know what, I don't wanna own the property with these kind of problems. I want this taken care of before I take on. So by going through that consulting phase, you really give them some things to think about. And then you take the big picture and say, okay, here's your leverage, here's your negotiating position in this transaction. And as you work through it, because they need to know how much leverage you're gonna have. And you know, you're the one that's gonna advise them when they say, okay, well, here's what the inspector says, here's the 6 and 7 pages here. Give it to them, say, fix everything, the inspector says it's wrong. Well, everyone wants to have that happen. You know, a good listener and a good seller, just, that's it, we're through. Not gonna do anything. And it's terrible. You can never use what the inspector says in place of a request for repairs. Because their comments are not sufficient and not clear enough to be that request for repairs. And depending on the inspector, some inspectors, that far right checkbox, you know, inspector check all of them, all the way through. So they're all checked. And then you see those great comments, HVAC, operating as intended currently, but soon to fail. Where you can go with that? It is. So everybody good? With 9 was true. 10, if your seller, question, we good? If your seller is still occupying the property, you should discuss the risk they may face if the closing does not occur on time or even doesn't close at all. True or false?
They're gonna say true.
And notice how reverse the true and the false. So if you're used to taking the first one, you're just.
I know.
Yeah.
I noticed.
You got that? So here's our challenge. Here's our key here. You should know what your seller's circumstances are. Because if they're going to close today on this house and then close on the new home that you're buying the next day, it could be significant consequences if they don't close on time. So depending on where they're going to go, what they're going to do, what their circumstances are, be a real challenge. So you need to have that conversation with them from day one. It needs to be part of how good we all feel about a particular buyer and their circumstances. And you need to stay on top of what's going on in the transaction. So when red flags tend to pop up, the seller can kind of be warned before they finally like move out 2 days prior to closing and then find out the buyer's not going to close or they're going to close later or whatever. So you need to make sure you're on top of all that. Same thing with the seller's repairs. And in 7E, the seller doesn't have to do repairs when asked or even during the option period. They can wait till much later when they feel much better about everything. So as we look for red flags on the buyer side, this may impact on what the seller is going to do from a repair standpoint. So we absolutely need to have that conversation with them as you work through. Everybody good with that? Question on that? 11. You should discuss with your buyer the limitations of the seller contributions in 1281B. Everybody's familiar with 1281B is that seller concessions. But your limitations aren't there. What are the limitations? And fortunately, we have a lender person here. So when a buyer wants a seller to pay a certain amount of money for a seller concession, closing costs, whatever, tell us the things that the lender looks at that create certain caps. Here's the motor that we're willing to approve. What kind of thing?
Well, depending on the actual loan, if it's a.
So the type of loan, FHA, VA, conventional.
VA's more
Go.
lenient. VA's more lenient than conventional, so.
Okay,
Conventional, you probably get
okay.
a limitation of what you can
So like 3%, 6%, something like that.
It's a, looking for a 2-1 buy down, and that's gonna come from the seller. If it's, you're looking for certain parts for the seller to contribute, the seller can only contribute so much, 2% on a certain loan, but for VA, they can contribute more. If they want to contribute more for.
Does it also depend on the down payment? Does that come into play? So the key is there are limitations the lender looks at. So when it's not just a number the buyer and seller agree to. It has to be approved by the lender. In a cash transaction where there's no lender involved, we look at the things that are going to agree to. You don't have to deal with those lender things, but you've got to deal with the language you've got 1281B, where it talks about, things that can be applied to, should pay them out. Because all this stuff in paragraph 12 falls in the category of settlement and other expenses. Who owes what? Who's paying what? We've got one that's turned out to be first time we've ever had it, 55 years. We got the Texas Rangers involved. We got the FBI involved. Our general managers had to make statements to the police. We have a listing, we have a fraudulent buyer. Cash transaction, it's a $5 million listing. And what they put in 12A1B, what the buyer put in 12A1B is 500,000. Going 500,000 back in the seller. And that wasn't the only thing. We had other things in the contract. Big red flags. And when the seller always said, I don't think so. Don't even want to be in the same room with this. Turns out it's a fraudulent buyer. Turns out this buyer's name has popped up on other investigations with the FBI. And we're trying to get out from under a UCC lien that's been filed. Just crazy stuff. So we look for some of those kinds of things. In this particular case, there wasn't anything we could have done because we weren't going to take any action with this particular buyer because of how bad the offer was. But the buyer's agent took the offer signed by the buyer and sent it to the title company. And then had a document, Treasury Department document for $7.5 million, because they'd offered $7.5 million cash on a $5 million listing. So when they finally got that set up, had that going, say, wow, man. So the agents and all kinds of trouble, which means the broker who's now hired turns all kinds of challenges. How you doing, Mr. Rhodey?
How are you?
I'm doing good. I've taken
a very powerful group in here, very talented.
It's lots of good questions, and we got like 14 people on Zoom. So we got really a good group, and they're testing me. They're coming up with some really good questions, which I love. Because one of the things that you understand, every contract class I teach, I learn something. Like the difference between likelihood and possibility, which I had never thought of. That had to be brought up. So, Bob, likelihood's kind of negative and possibility.
I learned with income.
See? Yeah. Well, no. So as you're going through the process, make sure that your seller, depending on what they're about to do, you need to have that conversation with the seller. What's going on? What do you think about doing? And what happens to you? Are you going to be homeless or something if you already moved out prior to, so you got to make sure you work through all of those kinds of things. It's to be a real challenging conversation. Everybody good that 11 is true. 12, you should have a conversation with your buyer of a new home on escrows for taxes if on the first of the year of closing, it was a vacant lot, hadn't been built yet. So here we are, the taxes are based on that, $100,000 value for the lot, and it's now $1 million piece of property 6 months later. How much later? So you need to have a conversation with the buyer. Mostly you need to say to your buyer, if it's financing, you need to talk to your lender. What the lender's gonna do here, because all of a sudden you can have escrow shock if you're not prepared for that. And next year, when you have your new escrows based on the value of the property, $1 million piece of property as opposed to $100,000 lot, you need to be prepared for that. Now, presumably you guys go through some qualifying process and kind of allow for that future situation. Is that what the lender does in that?
Should be a projection, yeah, what it's projected to be, to let, and should, we typically should have a conversation with them, let you know that what it's gonna be, because yes, you're gonna, the likelihood you're gonna get a call from that person or the person that just bought it, why did my
Yeah, why did it go up so
escrow just
big?
go
Yeah.
up so much? And it's always the tax.
Yeah,
It's always the taxes.
yep. As everybody knows, January 1st, we established tax value. That's why on January 1st, you see all those appraisers walking around checking out properties. Some of them are watching football games, most of them are out working.
So
Yes,
question, when you're qualifying, like a first time home buyer or something, and they're buying a new build. And that new build is not going to have the, obviously the right amount of taxes. Are you qualifying on what you think the taxes are gonna be? Okay.
what's it projected?
They should be the when it's done and the underwriter, they will look at what it should be or what it's gonna be. And I think my understanding also, they'll also compare it to what title, with the title company as well. So their numbers will either match or they'll agree each other.
Now, this whole tax situation, because of our unique circumstances, with the $100,000 school tax exemption, that won't be actually effective till November 7th. November 8th, when it's passed. We will have a title company person coming in one of our classes in October. Talk about that, because while we've always had in paragraph 13, the proration paragraph, that if the numbers after closing are different, the parties agree to adjust it, and it's usually not a big deal. They do it, $100. This could be thousands of dollars. This could be significant. And so we're gonna have a title company person come in and talk to us, because right now, title companies this month are closing based on 2023 values, even though they're not certified till October 1st. They're using those, going through the process. And they're gonna be prepared to deal with the new proration numbers after November 7th. Like one of my agents in Rockwall were in class, they actually scheduled their closing for November 8th, so they'd have all the new everything numbers and work through that. So we're gonna have to make sure that we're dealing with that.
Didn't maybe Austin Knight or who, someone was in one of the classes
Yeah,
that said
we
something,
talked about that.
and that on October 1st, that they're going to post both of them.
Yeah, theoretically,
counties?
the taxing jurisdictions are supposed to post where here are the numbers with and without the $100,000 exemption. Unfortunately, they haven't yet done that. And they're not sure, but the title companies are going in closing with the 2023. Some title companies go ahead and prepared both of them as you work through it. The other challenge we've got dealing with the homestead issues. Not just because the 100,000 only applies to school taxes. The other is the timing of homestead, which is now all year. And whether or not the seller ends up taking their homestead to the next property or not, it's going to impact on the proration. And then the other complication is the seller says, no, we're going to move out of state, so we're not going to take our homestead. And then they change their mind. And then they decide to take it, so then that impacts on. So we're going to have to address both of those issues, because there's some things coming up that are some real challenges.
So what you were talking about, I think someone was talking about closing on November 8th so that everything's
Everything's said and done,
right,
because then we know for a fact that it's been passed.
right.
I mean, there's not a 1/10 of 1% chance in heck that it won't pass.
Right.
You're gonna say, oh, 100,000 exemption, I don't want that.
I don't
That's
want-
terrible.
Well, I was asking, because I was like, so was that theoretically or was that an actual case that was happening?
It's in one of my agents in Rockwall.
Okay,
They got
so,
a client that, you know, when they negotiated it and they're looking at the closing date, they decided to close it after November 7th.
so then they've already gone under contract, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, out of just curiosity, is the buyer gonna move in before closing date? And they're just
No.
gonna rent it out?
No. Not gonna close, and there's no buyer temporary lease, the buyer, they just change their closing date totally for proration purposes,
Gotcha.
make sure they got all the correct numbers as you work through it. Number 13, you should discuss with your buyer the limitations of the track inspection. What do you think, true or false? I hear true.
It's mentioned them, but I would leave that to the inspector.
So my question to you is, what are the limitations of the track inspection? What's the track inspector inspecting?
What he can see.
And the standard track required form is 64 pages.
A general
And so-
overview.
Pardon me?
Isn't it a general overview?
It is a general overview. It's an inspection of systems. While they will look for things like foundation issues and recommend that the buyer have a foundation company or structural inspection, they may recommend a roofer, things of that nature. Track inspections, they're not roofers, they're not foundation experts. Their HVAC is in general, they look for temperature differentials. It's not an invasive inspection. There are limitations. We're seeing, and we have for some time, particularly in a little bit more expensive properties. Buyers, in addition to the track inspection, are having HVAC. They're having electrical, they're having plumbing, they're having roofers, they're having other kinds of inspections done in addition to the track inspection. Because, you know, the HVAC, when you send them out, they're doing a little, not invasive, they don't, you know, unscrew anything or whatever, but it's a little bit more of a comprehensive inspection, particularly important in older systems. And same thing, you know, with the plumbing, if you've got plumbing, that's the cast iron pipes, and you deal with that issue. It's interesting, we're seeing more and more inspectors are offering some at some decent rates, the cameras. On the cast iron, so they got the cameras going in there looking for those situations. So a buyer knows up front how big a deal that is. You know, we do see inspectors make note of things like the Federal Pacific panels, electrical panels. One of our challenges is to make sure as we have those conversations that we've got a good sense of how big a deal this is. And you know, the common response of a seller is, you know, we've had this house for 10 years, had this Pacific all the time, no problem. Why should we agree to replace it or anything like that? The buyer says, well, you know, there's history of problems with and houses burning down and things like that. So people tend to be a little skittish about it. The degree to which it's a problem or not, that's a negotiation. But, you know, there are limitations to the track inspection. It's more, the Zoom person is right, it's more of a generalist inspection. It's not as specific as you would have when you send a plumber, electrician, HVAC, people like that. So you should have that conversation, I think. Because we don't want a buyer to think, well, I've had a track inspection, so I know everything I need to know. Everything is perfect, it's good, it's not a problem. And yet you've got a nice big house that has 3 HVAC zones. They go, oh, it's very, very hard, those areas, to make sure the track inspector has got the proper temperature differential for all 3 of them. 14, you should, so 13 is true. 14, you should discuss with your buyer the limitations of the seller disclosure notice and what the seller is really saying. True? Did I hear true? So tell me, what is the limitation of seller disclosure?
Only as truthful as sellers.
Only what the seller's aware of.
Yeah.
So, yeah, because in the seller's disclosure notice, and by the way, the seller's disclosure notice is as of a particular date and time, particular point. So when the seller does it, he's saying today. By the way, that's true of the inspection. When the inspector inspects the property, he's saying today, this operating is intended. Don't know what's going on tomorrow, but, you know, same thing. Seller says, here's what I know today. And to Marcia's points, there are 2 types of questions in the seller disclosure notice. There are fact questions, which you see in section 1, is something there and you've got yes, no, or unknown. And ask for things like the age of the roof and those types of things. And then there are awareness questions. And an awareness question, the seller is not giving you a fact answer. So when you ask, for example, if there are, and you have this on the Texas Realtor form, you don't have it on the Trek form. The question about oak wilt. And so to ask about, is there oak wilt? And it's a yes or no answer. But the question is an awareness question. And the seller says, no. And the buyer says, oh, good, man, we had oak wilt on the last house we had, and that was a real problem, so I'm glad we don't have oak wilt. That's not what the seller said, is it? So he's not aware. Seller may have no clue what it means. As I don't. I have no idea what oak wilt is.
I don't either.
But he's not saying there's not any, he's just saying I'm not aware of it. And so we need to understand that's a limitation. Limitation that seller is saying this on this particular day. He's selling what he is or is not aware of. And we need to recognize, particularly if the seller is on the house for a goodly period of time, people forget things. You know, they forget. Yeah, we did replace the water heater, didn't we? See, that was in, oh, you know what? You remember in 2020, when you had your hemorrhoid surgery? Right after that, a water heater went, that's when we replaced it. They don't know. People don't keep track of all that stuff. But the challenge is the buyer needs to understand they can hold the seller accountable for what they've done, what they've said. And the seller needs to understand they can be held accountable. That's why we like the seller to use Seller Shield, got that video, work through that process and do it. And what we need to make sure is while we're having all these great explanations, we're making sure no one thinks we're helping to complete this seller solution. Is a rattlesnake, you don't even want to be in the room. Everybody good with not being in the room with the rattlesnake?
Yes.
Okay. Even if it's in a cage. Question 15. You should have your conversation with your buyer about the 3 factors that will determine the release of the earnest money. Anybody remember the 3 factors? Bob, did you ever tell us about 3 factors? Well, obviously you think you did, don't you, Bob? Whether you did or not, at least you think you did. Here are the 3 factors. 1, what the contract says. So paragraph 7E, lender required repair. It cannot come to a settlement agreement. Contract terminates and the contract says, buyer gets the earnest money. Or somebody refunded the buyer. So what the contract says. Second is the actions of the parties. If the seller says, you know what, you're playing games with me here. This is well within that 5% figure and I've agreed to do them and you're not agreeing and you cause a problem. So not only am I not signing a release, we're suing you. So the actions of the parties flow to the 3rd factor, which is the title company. Because the title company has the earnest money. And the title company's policy on what they do with the earnest money is that 3rd factor. It's what the contract says, the actions of the parties, and then the title company. And the only, we talked about the termination option, 99% of all the title companies, if you do it properly. One title company, and it's not all the opposite title company, but one title company in the sale of the property addendum will release the earnest money with just the buyer signatures. Because in the release of earnest money, when that date hits in paragraph A of the sale of the property by buyer addendum, if the buyer has not satisfied the contingency or waived it, it automatically terminates. And because it says automatic, it doesn't require anything. It's not quite to the level of unrestricted right to terminate, but it's pretty close. And the Republic title, who used to be over here, who's up on Legacy now. Their policy is, if this happens, we're going to release earnest money with just buyer signature. Now, having said that, most of the title companies, if you go through the process in paragraph 18C of the contract, where it deals with demand, if the parties can't agree to the release of the earnest money, and one party makes a demand for the release of earnest money, if after 15 days we don't have a written objection to the other side, the title company can release earnest money with just one set of signatures. And that language in the contract came from the title company. But those three factors, you should understand it. And when you've got a deal where there's a dispute on the title company, before you go into this explanation of those three, you have to say two things. One, we don't have the earnest money. Two, we don't have any control of what happens to the earnest money. This is a buyer-seller issue, and it always is. Now, it may be a buyer-title company seller issue, but it's not an agent issue. We do not have the earnest money. And so we have no control over what happens. So everybody good with 15 is true, because you should have a conversation. Now you know the three things you should have a conversation with. 16, you should advise the seller about the possible contingency/termination rights of the buyer agreed to in the contract. Seller sometimes gets surprised. What do you mean they get to terminate? Where does it say they get terminated? Well, right there in the contract. So you ought to know, of course, you know the big one, termination option. You probably are pretty aware of it's a mandatory HOA. You've got that. You should also know in paragraph 7B2, if that's in the contract, you seller disclosure notice. If that's checked off, then the buyer has rights to termination related to the seller's disclosure notice. You've got the addendum, sale of the property addendum, backup contract addendum. You should have an awareness of all those rights to termination. Now, in addition to making the seller aware that here are things you've agreed to. By signing off on this contract, all those things that are in the contract addendum, you've agreed to. Are you aware of them or not? You have. You also need to make sure your buyer understands that there are some seller rights termination, primarily if a buyer hasn't paid the earnest money in a timely manner, seller has rights termination there. You work through. You probably don't want to go down the road of buyer has rights to termination if the seller fails to correctly disclose things, if they misrepresent things. Those are things that are going to require action in litigation. But you should have some sense of certainly all the big items that you the buyer rights termination that the seller has agreed to by signing off on the contract. So everybody good that 16 is true. 17, you represent the buyer and you know the seller is bringing $40,000 to close it. So they're upside down on the property. For most of this is not a short sale because you're bringing money and they're gonna be able to close. Most appropriate conversation you should have with the buyer is, hey, tell your buyer to require the seller to put up $40,000 with the title company now. B, create special language in paragraph 11 to protect your buyer if the seller defaults. C, have the buyer provide proof of funds. D, explain the risk to your buyer and let the buyer decide how much risk they're willing to take. What do you think? D. I like D a lot. D. You like B?
No, D.
Oh, D, yeah, D a lot. We just need to have the conversation. And there is a risk. I do like the idea if a buyer has a lot of good negotiating strength, let's see that 40,000 now. Let's give that now, because things could change between now and closing that you may not end up with. So I think, but explain it, have the client make a good decision. 18 is the listing agent. When you insert a name in the seller blank in paragraph 1 of the contract, you represent this is the person to person who has the authority and ability to convey title of the property to a buyer. Well, that's absolutely true, but we need to take it to heart. We're really telling the world we represent a seller who can sell the property. We represent a seller who owns property. This really comes into play. We've got estates and trustees and executors, administrators, all those kinds of things. You know, we're telling a buyer who's about to put up money and time and energy and commit to and about to be homeless, but he can't close on the deal, that, hey, yeah, this really is the seller, which means you've got to make sure you've done your homework. So when you're on that listing presentation and it's looking good and everything's going, it says, okay, I got to ask you a question. What makes you think you can sell this property? Who told you you're the owner? I've heard that before. You're not going to really say that, but you're going to have something close to that language. You really need to confirm. Fraudulent sellers is close to the #1 claim for a title company right now. If you add to it fraudulent sellers and fraudulent buyers, it is now the #1. We're having fraudulent sales, mostly acreage and vacant properties and vacant houses, but in other ways. And so we need to pay attention. We actually did a class where we talked about fraudulent sellers. Yes, question.
So I had a couple that bought a new build several months down the road, like 6 or 7 months down the road, I just happened to pull up their tax roll, confirm what their zip code was. When I pulled up the tax roll, it didn't have their name on it. An error had been made at the appraisal district or wherever it gets recorded. It took us 9 months to get that person's name off,
Wow,
get their names back on.
dealing with all the government help. Yeah. Because it's gonna be
So you
important.
can't trust the
because
tax roll.
You're right, because when they get ready to sell, it's gonna be important to take and prove that they are who they are because they're already sell. That's just, so 18 is true. 19, you represent the buyer under contract prepared to close in about 2 weeks. You get a call from an attorney representing a family member of the seller, saying the family member has a power of attorney to act for the seller because the seller is mentally incompetent. Or the questions that you have with the attorney. So, A, does the family member acting on behalf of the seller still want to sell the house? I'd like to know that. I mean, probably the single most important thing as far as getting things to closing is the buyer wants to buy and seller wants to sell. If that continues to be true, you're in fairly good shape. B, was the family member aware of the property being under contract? And if so, what just happened for them to step forward? Why all of a sudden, what's going on now? C, was the listing agent aware that the listing agreement might not be valid if the seller was incompetent? So at the time they entered into the listing agreement, the owner was already determined to be incompetent. You don't have a good listing agreement. D, was the power of attorney a durable POA? 2 types of powers of attorney. We understand all powers of attorneys go away if the person who granted the power of attorney dies. That's in all cases. But if it's an incompetency issue, the time they gave the power of attorney, they appointed, they were competent. But then they become incompetent. There's a language that goes into power of attorney called a durable power of attorney that allows the power of attorney to continue to exist if they should become incompetent. If it's a durable power of attorney, that's an important factor in dealing with an incompetent person. So D would be a really important question for you to ask. But that first one is awesome. Do they still want to sell the house? How are we dealing with it? 20, more important to memorize the language of contract forms used on a regular basis than to understand the concept of what the buyer and seller agreed to in the contract. I'm hopeful everybody says false. Memorizing is not the thing. We understand the concepts. Everybody good with that? Everybody, so you good with that? No memorization? What you really want to do is understand the concept. Thank you, James. 21, fortunately, the Traffic in Texas Realtor contract forms we use are written in clear and understandable language, so rarely is there a misunderstanding of the contract says. Absolutely true. I mean, that's how it's true. Everybody agree with that? We meet balls. Okay, guys, any follow-up questions? Good question. I mean, you guys did super. You did really good. And thank you, because this is the first time in almost 3 months that it's been me. We have panels and co-instructors, so thank you for coming and listening to me. I really like doing this. So, thank you.
We really like you doing it.
Appreciate that. This meeting is adjourned. Oh, that's right. Please, somebody open up our lunch in the back. I forgot about that. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, he brought us food. So get that out so people can choose it. That's good. I'll get one. I'll go back.
The whole bag for you is a turkey.
I got that. I picked up on that casual comment. Hey, it's good to see you again. You're looking great. Love your hair. I was hoping you'd get it fixed. That's good.
Right?
I love the way that you set it up with the question, that like some heads first. And then use this prompt to start. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's like the first page, it's like, I don't know, good question. I didn't even know how to think about it. Thank you again, Bob.
Thank you.
It makes my brain hurt, Bob.
I don't know what I want you to hurt, but I want you to think.
Much for.
Do you left?
That.
Oh, yeah, that's funny.
Okay.
Yep.
Do it, right? It wasn't-
Yeah.
I wasn't working, I wasn't doing this year out, but I found this, right? I'm just not this.
Yeah, it's gonna take a while.
That's it too long. So it's turkey and turkey.
Turkey and Italian. So I think your Italian's gonna be salami, ham and a turkey maybe.
Okay. Well, Jimmy John's is good stuff.
Yeah. Or. Have cups, the kitchen, yeah. There's cups of, okay.